My journey started with this question: why does so many protests end up in violent confrontation? From there, I started asking myself many other questions. Can I design for peaceful protests? How to avoid the escalation of violence in this context? What can I design to help citizens claim their freedom when it is threatened? What tools could we give to citizens in order to be heard without using violence and without being afraid by it? I had to start my research in order to immerse myself in this territory and understand what triggers violence in this context. From there, I identified what I considered the main reasons that trigger violence: anger, fear, lack of communication, lack of empathy, orders and rules. It is also after these first research that I chose some keywords to lead my thinking and design work: nonviolence, disobedience, civilization, empathy, communication, humor. In order to achieve peaceful protest, I started focusing on what was for me 2 important points: stopping violence and prevent the escalation of violence. For these reasons, my first concepts was divided in 2 categories. The first one, protection against violence, aimed to protect protesters from any attack, in order to make the use of violence useless. The second one, empathic tools, aimed to make each stakeholder think and understand the point of view and feelings of the opposite side. Here, protesters and police forces had to understand what gathered them, rather than what opposed them. The first category had to reinstate a certain balance between protesters, usually quite vulnerable in this context, and police forces, who were heavily equipped to prevent any feeling of superiority that could ease the apparition of violence. The suits I imagined were inspired by wildlife, but also relied on humor and nonviolent disobedience. The second category had to create empathic responses within the police forces. The different concepts relied on my research on empathy. As I studied the meaning of empathy, I took my inspiration from the mechanism that created it. For example, selfhood is the first step towards empathy, so I tried to increase this feeling. Moreover, there is no empathy without suffering, so I tried to translate this idea into my design response. As a designer, at that point, I wanted myself to be the provider of tools for protesters who wanted to feel safe during protests. The fact that police forces are more and more equipped and militarized creates an imbalance in the ratio of power. In order to achieve nonviolent protests, I had to take the side of protesters. For this reason, my concepts had to be easy to make and easy to share. The blueprints for my tools would be open-sourced, relying on a website or on flyers to share them. This method was inspired by my visit at the Disobedient Objects exhibition, where that kind of flyers were provided to visitors. In January, I was halfway through my journey and was struggling with the use of empathy as a way to achieve nonviolent protest. Indeed, through my research, I realized that empathy was more an ability which requires time if you want to teach, learn or develop it. In the context of protests, where protesters and police forces only interact during a short period, it appeared difficult to set up that kind of teaching, or expecting empathic responses which are only based on props. Yet, while I didn't give up on this notion, I emphasized the humorous aspect of my project by developing new concepts. Thus I introduced a satire within my project which slowly became more critical. Rather than giving tools as the only outcome for my project, I slowly decided to use it as a way to make a statement, to highlight and criticize a societal problem. This is a turning point in my project, and I will later be more radical on this approach. The confetti launcher backpack introduces the idea of a neutral stakeholder in the context of protests. He is a joyful vigilante who uses humor, a powerful game changer, as its weapon. By creating a joyful chaos, this individual aims to make protesters and police forces think and calm down, and thus, neutralize violence in its escalation. This backpack is a face-saving device for police and protesters. Since the beginning of the project, all my concepts intend to make people, and especially police forces, really think about the situation in order to prevent violence. Here, I approach this desire by openly making fun of the over-equipment and menacing appearance of police forces. This suit, made with pillows and teddy bears, is a distortion of police uniforms, and emphasizes their ridiculous aspect. The final form of the project embraces completely its critical approach towards the problem of police violence in the context of protests and how citizens are considered and treated in such a context. My approach for this relies more on humor and sensitivity in order to make a statement. I have decided to play with the ridiculous of the situation. I have made absurdity my weapon. After having approached different ways through different concepts to deal with the problem of violence, I decided to only select and develop the one that would suit my critic. I play with absurdity and criticize violence in all its forms during protests. For these reasons, I gave up on all the concepts that could appear as a threat for police forces. Everything that could have a slightly violent meaning disappeared. That is why I have not kept the confetti launcher backpack or the suit of armor. With this final form, everything in the project is part of my satire and critical approach. I designed a fiction that I want to be in the service of society. The protester is not only a user. He is a citizen that carries a message. This persona becomes a satire, a caricature, an activist. His appearance is soft, non-menacing but still provocative. The colors he wears are bright. He is the antonym of police forces. As a designer, I used typical orthodox design tools that I subverted to make my point. As the persona becomes part of the satire, I had to think of the best way to express its point. By relying on drawings, I turn its user journey into a comic. I imagine the journey of a citizen, who relies on absurd and caricature to make its point. For this reason, comic books and drawings, because they carry an history of political ambiguity and political satire, are the medium I decided to use to draw attention on this issue in the best way possible.